Welcome to the channel. This is the Permaculture classroom on the Sonoran Desert Grower. Today we're going to be talking about food forest theory. This is in complement of the Edible Baja blog. So in the article we were talking about a little bit about the genealogy of thought of food forest theory, and I wanted to get really in depth and cover a lot of information. And just kind of round out what I started talking about in the article. So the first thing I want to talk about is the main goal of permaculture is to establish a regenerative system. So that's the main thing we're trying to do when we're designing, is we're trying to recreate the patterns that we find in the natural ecosystem, because every place is different. So we go and study place, observe, and see how it regenerates itself, and we mimic those patterns to create a system that doesn't necessarily need us to recreate itself. So that's kind of the main goal, is to take a site from where it's at and to build it into a closed loop system, a regenerative system. So from my perspective, when we're talking about food forest theory, we can't really talk about food forest theory or permaculture without talking about indigenous people, and without talking about the concept of perceptional reality. And the reality that this has to do with culture, right? So culture is the filter that we use to understand the world and the experiences we're having within the natural world. So let's say, for example, you have a little human being right here, right? And right, then we have our lived experiences, right? And then we have our culture, which helps us filter and make and understand what's going on, and this creates our perceptional reality, our takeaway from the day. So it's important to understand that this is what's going on when we experience things, and that's why people will walk away with different things from the exact same experience, because we have different upbringings, we have different values, and it's going to affect how we break that down, that experience. So the reason I'm bringing this up is because indigenous culture is very different from Western European culture, and it's taken the Western culture thousands of years to come to the concept of permaculture, to come to the concept of food forest. And what I'm trying to put out there is that indigenous people were practicing permaculture, we were practicing food forest theory before these terms and ideas entered the Western mind, the Western perceptional reality, the Western culture. So let's talk a little bit about indigenous people and our perceptional reality and food forest theory. Get into in Western, the Western narrative about indigenous people on this continent is that we were not actively cultivating the land. We were not farming and all this stuff. Hunter gatherers, this whole thing. But that's because the European invaders that came over here, um, they they didn't see us as humans to start off with, and then they couldn't see the value in how we uh, practice our farming, which was very, very different. So let's talk about a little bit of this stuff. So um, let's talk about some of this perception of reality, this culture filter, and indigenous people. So when the European invaders came over here, um, the indigenous people were basically, because they were, in their interactions, they would be telling these invaders that we were human beings. And the concept of a human being and what it meant to be a human being is totally different between Western culture and indigenous cultures. I mean, by the time that the European invaders came over here, they had gone through the Crusades and the Inquisition and all these crazy things that normalized violence and brutality and authoritarianism, fiefdoms and kings and queens and all that stuff. So over here is totally different. So over here, a human being within indigenous culture was really a keystone species of the ecosystems we inhabited. We were an integral part of the ecosystem thriving. We developed ceremonies where we instilled respect and valuing water, fire, soil, plants, animals, and how to use them properly. And the idea of hunter-gathering comes from the migratory patterns of indigenous people. And what people fail to realize is that they were practicing permaculture, they were practicing food forest theory. They were moving from place to place according to the seasons and living off of what was available during that time period. And they weren't not interacting with the landscape in terms of farming it. It was more of an agroforestry type of setup where you go out and you establish relationships with certain plants, certain key plants and animals that you need to survive and thrive. So they would go out and harvest plants, harvest seeds, roots, and spread those genetics within the areas that they were caretakers of. So that's the other thing, is that for indigenous people, being a human being meant that part of that meant that we were caretakers of the land, right? So we were like responsible for the landscape and everything going on in the landscape. So the idea that indigenous people were not actively cultivating the land is totally wrong. It was just done totally different. For example, the ceremonies of indigenous people are tied to a place, right? And they're also tied to certain things that are happening at that point in time in that place. So it was a way to gather data and instill the patterns that were necessary to keep the community thriving in terms of the relationship with the plants and the animals and the water and the things that needed to be in place in order for people to eat and be able to take care of themselves, be able to heal themselves with plants and all that, be able to go and hunt game. So it was more of an agroforestry model. We didn't really domesticate animals. Some plants definitely were domesticated. There were definitely seasonal gardens. But in terms of the animals, it was done different. the conditions that the plants needed to thrive were created so that the animals would thrive, so that they would take off. So there's a book by Charles C. Mann called 1491. And in this book, he pretty much debunks the idea that indigenous people were not actively cultivating their land. And he makes the argument that we were a keystone species within the ecosystem, and we affected the survival and abundance of many other species. Our human activity allowed the plants and the animals to thrive. Because of colonization and the process of genocide, the institutional policies of genocide, it meant that the European invaders basically took out the keystone species, the human beings of this place, the caretakers of these places. So of course the wildlife population exploded. You know, you had an abundance of bison and deer and elk and all these different animals, and the forest became much denser because we weren't managing, you know, the land. And so when the Europeans came over here, you know, after the huge, you know, kill off of indigenous people to take their land, they saw like this wild, pristine environment, failing to realize that it was a direct cause and effect of the colonization and process of genocide. So that's really important to understand when we're reading these primary sources from back in the day that are written by European invaders, you know, people that came to this continent to colonize the land. So another huge misconception is the idea of that the indigenous people here were practicing slash and burn. That's totally wrong. So we were not practicing slash and burn. We were practicing slash and smother. Right? So what's going on here is that when you smother a fire, you're basically creating biochar. Now, biochar within the right context is basically the pinnacle of soil science. So let's talk a little bit about how you make biochar and why I think it's the big deal. So the way it goes down is what the indigenous people, let's take the classic example biochar in the Amazon, right? So in the Amazon, it's very hard in a tropical environment to hold on to nutrients in the soil because it's always raining, it's always being leached out, and then it doesn't freeze. The plants don't really have a dormant period. So we have, you know, trees that grow huge trees, dense canopies, not a lot of light penetration. So we have our huge trees, right? And then we're gonna have, let's put some bushes down here, right? We're gonna have some bushes. We're gonna have some bushes. Right, we got bushes. So what people were doing was they would harvest the track. They would chop this stuff down with stone tools, right? And a lot of people call this primitive technology, but let's talk a little bit about the culture filter. So why were indigenous people using stone tools when they had the know-how of how to work with metals? We had copper here, they were making copper. They had gold and silver. But why didn't they make their tools out of this stuff? Because they within their perceptual reality, water is so sacred that they had an understanding that if they were to go into that direction, it would be poisoning the water, the soil, and all these different things. It would have all these adverse effects. And you don't really have that issue when you're working with stone tools, and it's readily available, right? And they'll work just fine if you get down with that. So they would cut all this biomass, and what would happen is they would build these mounds, right, with all the tree trunks, and all the leaves would get packed in there, and then they would end up with like a mound of biomass. And then that mound, and this is traditional biochar making, and then that mound would get covered with like a thick cap of soil. So this is how they would activate it, right? They would throw all the soil on top, full of microbes, big old cap, right? And then they would have some air pathways. So let's do it like this. Just pretend this is 3D, right? And I'll color in the rest of the mound. So we're gonna cover up these trees, all this plant matter, all these leaves. And then we're gonna have these pockets where air can come in, right? And then they would start a fire. They would start a little fire in here. And basically what would happen is it would cook within that soil, or in that cap of soil. It would just cook, but it wouldn't really smoke, right? It wouldn't like burn off. So it would become basically charcoal. And they would wait for it to totally cool down, and they would dig it up. And the cap, in my opinion, is key to this stuff getting activated, because it's a very thick layer, and it's gonna get in there, and also from the ground up, right? And so they would, when they started harvesting this stuff, it would get all mixed in, and they would go and spread this out in this area, right? They would spread it out, and then they would plant their crops, and they would rotate. They wouldn't do, this is like, they would move this garden basically every season. It was a rotating thing. And if you think about that, as genius, because you're building the soil throughout your region. And when you're, especially in the tropics, you're creating a medium, biochar, that can hold on to the nutrients, that can provide drainage and aeration for the root zone in a very wet environment. And you're creating a lot of microbially active biomass with locally sourced materials. It's pretty easy. So it's human engineering of soil microbiology through biological processes, right? And this is native science, and it's taking Western culture pretty much 500 plus years to get to a point where they can understand what we were doing, right? Where they can understand the genius of doing biochar. Like, for example, if you're in the Appalachians and you can't afford to bring like a semi truck to dump a bunch of compost every season, you can do biochar. You have a bunch of trees, right? Tall trees, chop them up, create a mound and everything. You can do the exact same thing that the indigenous people of the Amazon have been doing forever to build soil. So the perceptional filter of culture really affects how we do things and how we think about things, right? So we didn't practice slash and burn. We practiced slash and smother. Another thing is the process of slashing and smothering and the cultivation of biochar and using biochar encouraged abundance in game animals because there's an abundance in plants that they could use themselves. So in my opinion, indigenous people have been practicing food forestry and permaculture theory for a very, very long time. And it's taken Western culture since our interactions 500 years ago. So it's taken Western culture a long time to catch up with us. We've been here for thousands of years, in terms of permaculture design and food forest theory. We just didn't call it these things, and you gotta remember, the European invaders, when they came over here, they burned all of our books. So any information that we did have written down got burned. It's gone. So it's hard to say like how advanced we were in terms of soil science and agroforestry and everything, and the managing of natural ecosystems and interacting with them in a way where we can get production out of them. Okay, so I really wanted to cover that piece before we got into like the whole Western thought and philosophy around this stuff, because that's the difference with me, is that you're gonna get this indigenous perspective on this permaculture game. So now we're gonna get into the genealogy of thought when it comes to food forest theory. And there's a Japanese practitioner or grower, Toyohiko Kagawa. Now, he is known for doing dance tree plantings in Japan in the 1930s. So, in the 1930s in Japan, he was planting trees in the uplands where they had a lot of soil erosion. So his big idea was, let's put a bunch of trees to deal with the problem of the soil eroding. And he studied in the United States. So he actually went to Princeton University, and while he was at Princeton, he was exposed to a book called A Permanent Agriculture. And this book is by J. Russell Smith, right? So J. Russell Smith wrote this book, A Permanent Agriculture, and so what happened was he got super inspired by this book. And let's think about it: a permanent agriculture, permaculture, permanent agriculture, permanent culture. So again, the genealogy of thought is super important. Where do these ideas come from? So J. Russell Smith planted that seed, and it inspired Toyohiko, right, to use trees when he got back to Japan to keep the soil in place. So let's take it a little bit further, right? So he's planting these trees. He's in Japan. And so what happens is he comes up with a bunch of things that kind of, in my opinion, affect permaculture today. So he emphasized food bearing trees. He mainly did walnuts and pigs. That was kind of his thing. He was into growing walnuts and letting the pigs forage through there, and then harvesting the pigs. He took it even further. He had the concept of 3 dimensions. So one is fruit trees. Two is nut trees. And 3 is that it supplies food for humans and animals. So that was his 3 dimensions that he's trying to get out of tree plantings, planting trees, the idea of a permanent agriculture, which trees, you know, it makes a lot of sense. They're perennials. Once it's a plant them once you're done kind of thing, and they provide the structure, the form for the function. So he was emphasizing the planting of fruit trees and nut trees because they supplied food for humans and animals, and he called this the 3 dimensions. So this is super, super important when we're talking about where these ideas come from, the genealogy of thought. So Toyohiko Kagawa, he makes it in here because of his 3 dimensions and the work that he did in the 1930s to save soil. So this brings us to Robert Hart. So Robert Hart is a legend, and he coined the term forest gardening. And Robert was a raw vegan, and he really believed in the Hippocratic philosophy of make food your medicine and medicine your food. And within indigenous culture, there's, you know, in the ceremonies you always hear, food is medicine, food is medicine, food is medicine. And it's true. Like, if you're eating right, you're gonna be in good health. So he developed a gardening system that he called the forest gardening, and it provided the staples of his raw vegan diet. So for him, what he was growing was fruit. He was growing nuts, veggies, right? Leafy greens, fruit that doesn't grow on trees, you know. So that was kind of the staples of his diet, and he was able to develop a system that would produce these things for him with minimal work on his part. And the way he got to his theory of gardening and his method was through studying the woodland ecosystem, aka the woodland forest. He was able to establish a concept of the forest garden, which is very, today we would call this, we would, house this under agroforestry. And basically, he took it to the next level. He fleshed out the whole theory. When you hear people talking about landscaping and they're talking about stories, having different stories or different layers, it's coming from people like Robert Hart, who studied the woodland forest systems, and he developed this forest gardening theory. So I'm gonna erase some of this stuff so I can put it up here. The first one is the tall tree layer, right? The second one is the small tree layer. And then we have the shrub layer. And then we get the one that everybody loves, the herbaceous layer. Everybody loves the herbs. And then we have the ground cover. And then we got the rhizosphere, also known as the vertical layer. But we're basically talking about vines in the vertical layer. So he came up with this 7 tiered system, right? And he basically saw that this is what was going on in the woodland forest. We had your tall tree canopy, your small tree canopy, and then you had your shrub layer, your herbaceous layer. So a lot of these are like the flowers. These are like bushes, right? This would be like, so let's talk about Sonoran desert stuff. Right here for us, the tall tree layer, we're talking like mesquites, ironwoods, especially in urban areas. And then the small tree layer would be like elderberries, acacias. The shrub layer, like wolfberries. Herbaceous layer would be like most of the flowering plants, like a datura or something like that, prickly pear, or prickly poppy. And then right here, the ground cover, like a lot of the verdolagas, the purslane that comes up wild, the rhizosphere, like milkweeds, and rhizosphere would be like desert rhubarb, and then the vines, there's an Arizona grape, there's milkweeds, there's different vines, right? So within every distinct ecosystem, you're gonna see this happening, this pattern of nature happening, and this is how the forest regenerates itself, right? So Robert Hart is a big deal. He's a legend, and he coined the term forest gardening in the 1980s. He was a raw vegan, and he would basically farm or garden in this manner. Okay, now let's talk about Bill Mollison. So he pretty much coined the phrase permaculture, and he developed the permaculture design course that everyone takes now. And he's from Australia. He also studied the forest like Robert Hart, and in October 1990, they met, and Bill adopted forest gardening theory into the permaculture framework. So then Bill starts teaching people, because Bill's always been teaching people, right? He's never stopped. He's still around and stuff. So he's been teaching people, and he's been, teaching his students forest garden, food forest theory. So Robert Hart called it forest gardening, and Bill Mollison is kind of the person that took it and tweaked it a little bit and started calling it food forest. The food forest, the idea of having a food forest, a forest that produces food, And if you look at a lot of the videos, like dangers of falling fruit, like a lot of the educational promotional videos that Bill put together to promote permaculture really harps on this idea of creating a forest that provides food. So Bill Mollison is kind of responsible for tweaking the idea of forest gardening to food forest, having a food forest. And so some of his students really took it to the next level, and it's kind of like where what we think of now as a food forest. These are the guys that kind of established that idea. So we have, I'm gonna give you guys a series of books that you guys should read, because these are like foundational. This is foundational reading material when we're talking about food forest theory. So we have the Permaculture Garden, and this came out in 1995. So 5 years later from that meeting between Bill and Robert Hart, and this is written by Graham Bell, right? Super great book. You should check it out. And then we get into how to make a forest garden. And this one is a little bit later in 2002 by Patrick Whitefield. Right? Also a great book. And take note, he called it a forest garden, giving a shout out to the legend Robert Hart, right? So again, genealogy of thought. So then, after How to Make a Forest Garden, we had another book come out called The Edible Forest Gardening. Again, giving a shout out to Robert Hart by using the term forest gardening. And this one was written by Jack and Townsmeyer. And then so this is all fine and dandy, right? Like, these books are being put out there, and it's good because people that can't afford a permaculture design course could afford a book and still kind of get into the meat of it. So it's putting the idea out there. People are practicing this stuff all over the globe. And then what really blows it up is the film establishing a food forest. And this was put together was released in 2008. It was put together by Geoff Lawton. And it's basically what put him on the map, and pretty much, well, first of all, Geoff Lawton is like a star alumni of Bill Mollison, right? So he was kind of already on the map, but this film is a great educational documentary, great how-to. So what pretty much happened is when he put this out, it spread like wildfire. People were getting the DVD, because this was in 2008, right, when DVDs were still around. So people were buying the DVD, they were uploading like under 10-minute segments of it onto YouTube, because back in the day you could only do 10-minute videos and stuff. That was like the max. So they were, putting little snippets of the movie up on YouTube, and it was like taking off, right? because Geoff did a great job on this film, and it really, really popularized the idea of a food forest, and that this is the way to grow, right? And I feel like it had way more impact than the books because it was visual. Visual media is like you could see him establishing the food forest. You could see it happening, right? You weren't just reading about it, and he was able to show you, like, in year one, this is what it's gonna look like, and then he would fast forward to a different part of his land where it was like in year 5 of a food forest practices. So it was very impactful. So these, in my opinion, these 3 books and this film is basically what put food forest theory on the map, and made it such a central permaculture concept, right? I hope you enjoyed this workshop. I'm going to be doing more permaculture classroom type trainings and putting out really good information.